Welcome, everyone. This is our Nuggets of Wisdom live, Building Collective Resilience, hosted by Transition Network International and the Cultural Transformation Circle. Our topic today is As Things Fall Apart, Composting Modernity into Earth-centric Cultures. And I'm in conversation with Claire Milne. Claire Milne is one of Starter Culture's co-founders. She has a long history in activism and global justice campaigning. She previously worked as the Inner Transition Coordinator for Transition Network. And I'll just throw a couple of words into the mix. She also studied anthropology, psychology. She worked with food systems. She lived and worked with the Buddhist community. She's very much involved with soul initiation at the moment, connected to shadow work and embodiment, or also involved with shadow work and embodiment. And I also found another word in the mix that I have in common with you, Claire. That's the work that reconnects. My name is Teresa Fent, and I am part of the Cultural Transformation Circle. I also have a bit of anthropology in my background. I studied anthropology and theatre, film, and media science. I've been in social change making for the last 10 years or so, but more from an innovation and entrepreneurship perspective. I had an intense period of climate activism as well, and also experienced some burnout, which I think is another thing that we have in common, and learned more about my own nervous system and the collective nervous systems with Healthy Human Culture and Sophie Banks. And now motherhood has brought me a whole lot of new perspective on all of those things. So I'm really excited to have this conversation with you today. Thank you for joining.
It's great to be here after our technical hiccups.
As things fall apart, composting modernity into Earth-centric cultures is the title of our conversation, but also the name of an 18-month program that you're working on. And we'll have some more time to come back to that a bit later. But to start us off, I was really curious to talk with you a little bit about what it is that is falling apart. What do you mean when you speak to that?
Yeah, it's interesting the way that framing came about, those words. It kind of felt like it was just a naming of kind of almost like the elephant in the room. It's like
Mm,
kind of looking around at, whether it's at our ecosystems, species extinction, um, environmental collapse, climate collapse, um, or whether it's our social systems, public health, education, mental health, physical health. So at that systemic level, it just feels like things are falling apart. If we look
mm,
back, how things were 10 years ago, 20 years ago, things really are falling apart. And I look around, at human beings around me, and most of them are also falling apart in a way that
mm,
they weren't maybe 10 years, 20 years ago. Um, yeah, so there's something of kind of naming, um, yeah, a kind of elephant in the room in a way of kind of like, yeah, there is a reality to the times that we're living in, being times where things are falling apart. And there's something about the
mm,
importance of recognizing that rather than trying to pretend it's different. Because when we try to pretend it's different, because that's an uncomfortable reality to have to kind of get, you know, confront and welcome. When we don't confront it and we don't welcome it, then it starts to distort and um,
mm,
makes it harder to be with when we're not willing to welcome it, is my experience, kind of fractally across all levels of scale.
mhm. And I
Mm.
was really curious also to get a bit into the difference between this falling apart and the composting.
Mm.
because composting is also a process of falling apart
Mm,
in a way.
mm,
And in your framing, I felt like the composting is something active. So the falling apart might be something that is happening around us or even happening to
mm,
us. And
mm,
the composting might be the bit where there is some agency and some holding. So I was really curious to hear a little bit
mm,
how you think about that.
mm. Yeah, I mean, the word composting, we choose to use the word composting, partly because it's earth-centric and it really kind of connects us with the other than human and inspires us in terms of that process of composting where we put, dead matter into the compost heap
Mm,
to become good soil. And so it's really pointing to how when things are falling apart and dying, when whether that's systems or ways of being or food or humans, then to intentionally compost. I get on board with the reality that something's falling apart or something's dying and actually
mm,
support it to die in a good way in a container, with containers. Because if you don't put compost in a container, it tends to just rot. Whereas if
mm,
you create a vessel, a container, um, and it gets the ingredients it needs, the right amount of air, not too much, not too little, and all of the things, then um, then yeah, we get good soil rather than rot. And so this is the kind of languaging we're choosing because it kind of it feels helpful in regards to kind of how we might kind of turn towards what's happening in the world and what's happening within ourselves and our groups and organizations and communities. And instead of kind of resisting the reality that things are falling apart and that
mm,
this overculture, we might call it, this perhaps we might call it power over or modernity, that to some degree it really is dying. And so rather than trying to fight that and trying to find ways to survive within that, it's like, composting points to this, like, oh no, how do we support it to die in a good way? And our particular interest in within this composting modernity is from the inside out. It's like rather than pointing out to all of the systems and structures that need composting, which they do, our
mm,
particular focus is on how do we compost support to kind of die the ways of being and relating and showing up in the world that actually kind of are the underbelly of all of the structures and systems, because it's the consciousness. Ultimately it's composting consciousness to some degree so that we expand our consciousness. In the composting becomes there becomes an expansion of consciousness that includes more and goes beyond the consciousness that created modernity and the consciousness that created its power over underbelly and perpetuates it.
mhm. Mm, I was also curious about the relationship between your work and what, for example, Vanessa Andriotti is speaking to when she's
Mm,
talking about hospicing
mm,
modernity.
mm, mm,
Um, I I looked up what she actually means when she speaks
mm,
of modernity, and I think you mentioned now a couple of dimensions that are quite aligned. She says it's a story of linear progress, development and evolution, and civilization that shapes how we think, imagine, hope, desire, and even experience pleasure and fear.
mm.
Do you see your like what is the difference between composting and hospicing, or is it a very similar thing?
Well, it's interesting because I literally just over a week ago spent a week with Vanessa out here
Mhm.
in New Zealand. That we were on a
Mm,
tour together. So yeah, so I yeah, it's funny that you asked that question. Um, So there's a lot of overlap. Not There's a lot of overlap in terms of what we're our aims and intentions and kind of where we're coming from and how we understand the world. And our methodology is very different.
mm,
Or compatible, entirely compatible. So first of all, the way that you've just kind of described Vanessa and and her collective talk about modernity, then we would totally align with that. And the way that we tend to phrase it, which, they're both kind of useful and compatible, is we say it's, modernity is kind of like the combined threads of white supremacy, racism, patriarchy, heteronormativity, gender normativity, neuronormativity, ableism, classism, all of these kind of normative forces that have power over under, that dance between power over and under as their
Mm.
underbelly ultimately. And that, when we talk about modernity, it's kind of like talking about the collective force of all of those different kind of cultural forces that
Mm-hmm.
share this power over under underbelly. So it's a different way of saying the same as what you've just shared from Vanessa there. And in terms of is hospicing the same as composting, I'd say yes in a lot of ways. Although again, for us, the reason that we use the term composting is really wanting to bring in a kind of more earth-centric languaging,
Mm-hmm.
because it's like that helps to shift the consciousness and expand our consciousness beyond human centrism. And again, Vanessa's work is very also wanting to support us to become more earth-centric and a lot about the more than human. And another kind of way of seeing the relationship between the two bodies of work would be that I'd say that the gesturing towards decolonial futures are tending to kind of a wider terrain, and they point to the particular node of that terrain that we're doing as one of the various things that need to happen to compost modernity. So they're not only talking about from the inside out, whereas we go in a way that they don't. We go into so much kind of depth and embodiment and long programs that are specifically around how do we actually kind of compost these ways of being in a really kind of deep and sustained and transformative way. And that and I would say that's, they don't go in as deep, so they're much broader, and we're kind of down a particular rabbit hole of the how does that actually happen in our systems and our beings to actually really compost these ways of being and relating. Yeah.
Mm. Maybe this is a good way into the program or the course that you're preparing.
Mm.
It's a program that helps us to befriend the uncertainty and make ourselves available to a power greater than our human selves.
Mm.
And I also brought another quote from the PDF that you sent about the program. This soul-centric journey is not about fixing things, finding solutions, or becoming more effective within modernity. Rather, it's about building our muscle to be with what it is as things fall apart. And in doing so, making ourselves available to allow deep cultural transformation and collective initiation to emerge through us. So yeah, these words I feel like by themselves feel really evocative and powerful. And I would like to invite you to tell us what are they about? What is the
Mm.
program about?
Mm. Yeah, there's so many ways I could answer that. Maybe I'll kind of just riff a little bit off the last kind of quote that you just read, because I feel like that takes us into the wider terrain, and then maybe we go in a bit more into the how. Um,
Mhm.
so yeah, I mean, in a lot of ways, the way that we're relating with, you know, these times and things falling apart and the need to compost is recognizing it as collective initiation, that there is a collective initiation happening as
Mm.
a species, in a kind of way that we are collectively going through a dying of this culture. And that when we turn towards that, both as composting and as initiation, it's like we open ourselves to the to unknown possibilities. And so rather than seeing death and dying and falling apart as problems, it's like how do we lean into them actually as opportunities for transformation and going beyond, and as initiation that kind of actually births us as something completely new that's died to the old identity.
Mm,
in recognition that we've kind of got no choice other than to do that as a species, just because we can't continue in the way that we are, in terms of, if you look at what that's doing in the environment, and on a climate level, it's like we just can't continue in that vein. And so it kind of makes sense that that initiation is upon us.
mm,
It's like the greater forces are kind of jumping in and giving us no
mm,
choice but to die to this old, outdated culture, this way of being. Um, and then, yeah, this kind of the kind of the surrender, making ourselves available to a power greater than our human selves. This is very much what the composting is aimed at. It's like, how do we allow the kind of predict and control and defend and fix and solve kind of conditioning. We've been so conditioned to kind of be in that kind of mode of like fixing or solving or defending or trying to control and predict. And that's kind of just normalized. We just don't even realize, but that's just our normalized consciousness is that. And it lives in our bodies and our beings. And so a lot of what we're up to is around supporting those that are interested to kind of be on a depth journey that really is looking at how do we compost that so that we can actually put those ways of being to rest, so that something new can come through. And in the very design of composting these kind of predict and control ways, it's like we have to be able to sit with the uncertainty of not knowing what will then happen. If we're not
mm,
controlling, then
mm,
we need to sit with the uncertainty. And again, these times are giving plenty of opportunity to sit with uncertainty. Um, and and it's in that working that muscle of being able to be with uncertainty and the vulnerability that that brings and the fears that that brings of not having a sense of control, is where, that's how we become available to supporting the emergence of what's wanting to happen, as we could say earth streaming. It's like, what is it that earth or cosmos or mystery is dreaming through us, in this much bigger lens. If we take off the human-centric lens that's kind of so obsessed that we know how to fix this and it's just us, and
mm,
we have to come up with our clever strategic plans for how we're going to adapt to these times. It's like, what we're up to is really composting that belief system to say, no, we need to be actually just finding a quality of consciousness, a state of consciousness that allows us to get on board with what mystery, cosmos, whatever we want to call it, is dreaming through us. And that takes a deep time perspective. That takes a much, much wider lens on what's happening in these times than most of the narrative that's being shared. And in our experience, when we do this depth work to compost these ways of being that we've been conditioned into, there is something very potent that happens. It's like the way I hear myself speak about it is, it's like, oh, I feel like I'm in life's slipstream. And
mm,
it's like, when and it's not always like that, but when that happens, and I feel like we're being invited into life's slipstream at a collective
mm,
level. And if we fight the falling apart and don't kind of turn towards the composting, then we're not going to be in life's slipstream, and it's not going to be fun. Whereas I think if we actually turn towards what's happening, in our experience, that's when actually things start to become more easeful, because rather than trying to turn it in a particular direction, we're actually getting on board with what's happening. And then something else is born. It's not that we're saying that all of the pain and the suffering is to be celebrated and a great thing, but it's like a recognition that because it is happening, there's something about being able to surrender into it, and then from that place, invite something else to happen. Um, yeah.
mm. Yeah, I'm catching myself making sense of what you're saying also by really relating it to my experience of motherhood, where where I feel a lot of the same principles, like of initiation into something completely unknown and different, is happening on a physical, spiritual, emotional, um, societal level, and I also came to think about it as an initiation that needs holding, that
Mm.
can feel very overwhelming and traumatic, and soul crushing if there isn't this layer of making sense, of having support, of building capacity, yeah, being held as we are facing what is new. And that if that is there, it can really be a very transformative and very empowering experience, while it is also an experience of completely letting go and not
Mm.
being in control and not knowing and not seeing where actually
Mm.
you're headed.
Mm.
Um,
Beautiful. Yeah, that
mm,
is a really great example of a place that it shows up for so many people. And I'm sure, anyone listening in who is a parent will really relate to, yeah, if you try and control then and try and predict,
mm,
you're not, that's not where the kind of flourishing kind of comes from, right? In when you're
mm,
parenting. So yeah, it's
mm.
touching to hear you include that example.
So I see you now a little bit like in the role of a midwife or somebody who is creating this container, creating this space, creating um, threads that carry us through this moment of transformation.
Yeah, I mean, in a lot of ways, the work that we do is both kind of death doularing because it's supporting the dying, as well as kind of um, midwifing the birth of the new. And, and we're kind of holding that within starter culture, both at an individual soul level of, when we do this composting work and we're supported through a kind of soul-centric lens, so, through practices of soul crafting, which is kind of central to the program, the 18-month-long program. These soul crafting practices, and alongside the composting, allow a process of soul initiation to happen so that we become initiated into the particular gifts that we were called into this lifetime to live as, kind of really celebrating that uniqueness of each of us and that there
Mm,
is a particular purpose we're here to serve. So that's a really important thread of what we hold. So as much as we're holding it at a kind of collective level of like how does it show up in groups and organizations and culture, and how do we kind of co-create these earth-centric relational cultures rather than the kind of human-centric power over cultures that we've kind of been conditioned into. So we're weaving together both the death doularing and the kind of supporting the birth of something new at the same time as it being about soul initiation, and decolonizing within that, decolonizing being so essential to the composting process. It's like it's inherent within there. I mean, if we're only looking at changing our ways of being and relating, kind of through a kind of neutral lens, then we miss something really important because, of course, we've been so conditioned into particularity through colonialism and all of the other kind of isms I spoke about within modernity. So yeah, so there's a death doularing and a midwifing, and in within the soul initiation process, we call that the metamorphosis kind of stage when something new is being born, and it's like you've had an encounter with this soul image that you were called into this lifetime to live as, your particular way of loving the world and being in relationship with everything. And then the kind of the metamorphosis process is when our ego is then being kind of reshaped in a way that allows it to actually be able to show up in the world in that way, because it needs new ways of being to be able to be that particular creature that is here to love the world in that way and relate with everything, human and otherwise. So yeah, there is definitely a strong midwifing role in there too.
mhm. Yeah, I feel death and birth are very, very close in many different ways. And what you've been pointing to now when you spoke about soulcraft is kind of also what allows me um, to mother in a moment where I feel that things are falling apart.
Mm,
That allowed me to step into this role and then to look at what is happening, also in very different doses depending on my capacity on each day, but to somehow be present with that and not look the other way. So um, I don't know if this is a very clear question that I'm holding, but well, first, maybe we could say a few words about what soulcraft is. Some people that
mm,
might be listening to us don't might not know.
yeah.
Um, yeah, maybe let's start with that.
Mm. So, soul crafting is a term that Bill Plotkin kind of came up with. That it's the name of one of his books, the first of his books, and he's the founder of Animas Valley Institute. Um, and I've been training with him for about maybe 8 or 9 years now. Um, so soul crafting is the kind of the process that kind of basically crafts our soul to be able to to reveal itself to us as a soul encounter. So it's like there needs to be this composting process that includes the kind of the healing and holding work that needs to happen for us to be ready to go into the composting. You know, there needs to be a degree of resourcedness in us
Mm,
psychospiritually to be ready to compost. And then when we're kind of at that stage of readiness to be composting and supporting this dying to happen at a psychospiritual level, it's so supportive then to be bringing in these soul crafting processes, which are really kind of infusing our life with soul. You know, like so, for example, dream work. You know, so allowing the what comes through in the dream world from the dream maker to kind of have its way with us, and not through interpretation and trying to predict and analyze what it means, much more of just trying to allow, support the dream to work us even more, so that we can kind of really be revealed as whatever it is that it's wanting to reveal to us through our bodies, through our beings, through our imagination. So that's a good example of soul crafting, is, you know, through the kind of lens of soul, kind of supporting this kind of expansion in consciousness. That, you know, it's often, you know, sometimes soul encounters, like where we actually have an encounter with our soul, happen through dream work. So it's a practice that's supporting a movement towards it's creating the conditions for soul encounter to happen. So deep imagination journeys is another example where we're kind of guided into the to accessing and being revealed as the deep imagination of Earth, of cosmos, and the kind of the deep architectural flavors that show up through us as humans at an individual and collective level across time. Um, so yeah, grief tending is another example. There are many examples of different soul crafting practices, but they're all within this kind of creating the conditions for encounters with our soul to happen. And that kind of, as I've said already, it's like that the condition, part of those conditions is the composting, is the kind of being able to be make ourselves available to the dying and to support that dying. Yeah.
mhm. And now I'm curious about the the way in which you're including those in the program, those soul
Mm.
crafting elements.
Mm.
Maybe I can just give a bit of information about the overall structure or shape of the
Mm.
program. It's 18
Mm.
months, so it's quite long. There
Mm.
are three 5 days gatherings in person in the UK that
Mm.
you're offering, and one 12-day gathering. Uh, there are 18 monthly live sessions, and there is one-to-one mentoring and different invitations to inquire with other than humans and the land.
Mm.
And I guess also a lot of space for emergence, for
Mm.
things to happen with whoever will be the people that show up.
Yeah.
Um, so I'm curious about this dance, or the type of rhythm that you're trying to create in this container.
Yeah, so there are four kind of modules that are based around what we call our four vital ingredients for composting modernity, for composting power over. And that, so they are um, becoming trauma attuned, or trauma as wild ally. So we could talk some more about that. And then
Yeah, that's actually
decolonizing.
one of my questions for later.
Yeah,
Hmm.
decolonizing at depth, becoming Earth-centric, and supporting emergence. So these are
Mm.
the four kind of vital ingredients that we've kind of have been revealed through us, through our work, through our research,
Hmm.
as kind of really vital ingredients within the composting process. So we're shaping the journey around those four ingredients. And then soul crafting, they're the practices that will kind of just run throughout, so within everything that we're doing, it will be infused with soul crafting practices. So there'll be lots of kind of earth-centric healing and holding work happening, and lots of as kind of in a way, just creating the container and the safety that's needed to then be able to go into the composting. And so we'll be doing a lot of composting in the first two modules. The becoming trauma attuned and decolonizing at depth is very much in that terrain of composting, and it will be infused with these soul crafting practices. So, for example, every morning on all of the programs in the quest, we'll be doing dream work. There'll be dream work each morning, and there'll be dream seeds each evening, and invitations to be in relationship with the dream maker, and lots of different soulcraft practices woven in, as well as kind of deep inquiry and embodiment work and cultural somatics that supports us to kind of really compost through the body, as well
Mm.
as the psyche. Um, yeah.
Hmm. Mm. Yeah, as you brought it up, maybe we can speak a little bit about what you meant with civilization trauma's wild ally. What is that?
Yeah. So, yeah, there are two kind of pieces there. So, we framed the term civilization trauma um, to kind of point to the fact that actually civilization in itself is a traumatizing force, and that it self perpetuates. It then kind of continues to perpetuate that trauma. Um, the trauma kind of perpetuates itself, but the kind of continuation of civilization just means that we're just stuck in this kind of hamster wheel of being continually re-traumatized at a personal and collective level and ancestral
Mm.
level. And so we framed that because it feels helpful, because the word trauma tends to get used with the presumption that we're just talking about personal trauma that happens to an individual in this lifetime. Whereas
Hmm.
when we talk about trauma, we're talking about it in such a broad way that is across lifetimes, ancestral, collective, and results from civilization. And so we're all subject to it, And so, the way that we understand it is that all of our bodies are carrying trauma. There's increasing evidence around the epigenetics of trauma. And if you look at our collective histories of war, and all sorts of kind of atrocities throughout the centuries and millennia, it's, of course, we're born into the world with epigenetically with trauma. And it's easy to kind of for it to become a bit of a kind of unspoken thing of kind of like, oh, it's those broken ones over there that have trauma. and
Mm.
and but not me. I've got it together. I'm kind of yeah, that's not me.
Hmm.
When with civilization trauma, what we're pointing to is that we all have trauma. The question is your being resourced enough for it to start revealing itself through you so that you can heal and transform it and expand your consciousness? And that's a very different way of looking at trauma. That's looking at trauma as wild ally and recognizing that actually trauma is such an ally, because the only way that we can, if we have the support, I should add, that's very important. It's not an
Mm.
ally if we don't have support. It's, and this is not to minimalize at all what it's like to live, with trauma unraveling through us, as I know very well myself. It's a grueling experience. And when we are lucky enough that we have the conditions to support that to be transformed and healed, then it creates the conditions that are exactly what's needed to be with uncertainty.
Mm.
Because from that place of trauma unraveling in us, we can't predict and control. That's the very essence of when trauma is unraveling in us. It's like our capacity to perceive that we're in control has gone, and that to parts of us is terrifying, and
Mm.
that's kind of the nature of trauma. And so the only way to heal trauma is through our bodies, is somatically. We can't heal trauma through the mind, which is a perfect design, because it was an overemphasis on the mind that's got us into this pickle in the first place. So it's, making us come back into our bodies as the only way of healing trauma. And it's expanding our consciousness into true relationality. And, without that healing, then, and without touching that level of fear and feeling out of control that we're kind of forced into when we heal trauma, um, we don't cultivate the muscle that allows us to sit with certainty in the way that allows us to not have to keep defaulting on automatic to the protective strategies we've developed, so that we don't have to feel the discomfort of uncertainty or the discomfort of particular emotions or wounding. And so, healing trauma supports us to really work that muscle. That means we no longer default to these protective strategies that are predict and control, that are power over, that are modernity. So I'm aware there's a lot in there, what I've just said. So
Mm.
feel
Mm.
free to kind of poke about and ask questions to unravel it a bit.
Yeah, where I am at with it right now is that what trauma healing allows us to do or what healing looks like very often for many of us isn't that we completely get rid of our trauma responses, of our stress responses, of the parts of us that were protecting us. Um, but we gain greater choice. Like there is more space for us to react, to see what's happening, to have more agency. And then there might be different phases in which we do have access to this choice, or we have access to enough resources so we are able to act from this place, and other moments where we're not.
Yeah.
And the question that came up for me now is like how much composting or healing, especially when we're speaking about collective trauma or civilization, is possible while we're still living in a context where a lot of it is active and
Yeah.
around, where it's not just coming from inside of us, but it's still
Yeah.
happening. Even as it's falling apart, it's still happening. So what would you say about that?
Yeah, I would say that this is one of the biggest challenges of these times, this particular historic moment of like, how do we create the containers to expand into um, a wider sense of consciousness that is beyond, um, you know, uh, so steeped in trauma and power over, when that is the consciousness we're steeped in. It's like it's such a paradox, such a creative tension. And it's almost like it's being in the grapple of that that is the work. There isn't a kind of um, magic bullet solution to that. It's almost like, and there's also a reality that we are all here to do different work in this lifetime. And, for some people that won't be their work, and it will remain kind of unprocessed. We all carry a certain degree of unprocessed trauma, and you know the image that we've been called into this lifetime, or the soul image that's called us into this lifetime, has a lot to do with the degree to which we're going to be healing trauma. It's like,
Mm.
because it's not going to be everybody's work, and not everybody's going to get the conditions that are needed to
Mm.
heal it in a good way, and that really sucks. A lot of our work is really trying to address that as well. We did a lot of research, cups of tea process, and I wrote a long report for funders around, why it's so essential that funders support inner-led change, for this very reason, because otherwise it's just another layer of deep, deep injustice, inequality, because only
Mm.
those that can afford
Yeah.
support to heal and transform trauma, and do soul initiation work and decolonizing at depth work and composting work. It's only those that can afford it, who are privileged by modernity, that can get that support. So that's a huge issue. That feels really important to be addressing, and
Mm-hmm.
in a lot of ways, the sort of what we might call the wellness kind of movement, unfortunately, has tended to kind of bring the healing of trauma into a more capitalist, individualistic, human-centric model that feels doesn't feel entirely helpful or very helpful at all.
Mm-hmm.
It feels, the importance of bringing in a political perspective and a cultural
Mm-hmm.
context um, feels so important. That it isn't about personal well-being. Personal well-being is an illusion, because we are all inherently connected, not just as humans, but as you know, the other than humans, the more than human. And in fact, we talk about something called primal attunement being kind of our mother culture to the starter culture. And we framed that actually because what we were seeing was that, attachment trauma healing attachment trauma has become all the rage. And what we were seeing was that it's so framed and through such a human centric lens, with this presumption that the way that attachment trauma is healed is just through kind of creating healthy relationships with ideally one other human in a romantic context. And we were being driven quite mad by this, of like, no, that's not the world we're living in. Like, come on.
Mm.
And so we framed the term primal attunement to kind of recognize that there are actually four dimensions to attachment, and maybe it actually needs to become attunement rather than attachment.
Mm.
And these four dimensions are attunement with self, attunement with other humans, attunement with the other than humans, and attunement with the more than human.
Mm.
So the ancestral realms, the invisible, unseen realms. Um, and it feels like that in itself, that framing, and just recognizing, oh, okay, like we can't heal the attachment trauma that actually really is at the core of a lot of the civilization trauma we're talking about. Um, we can't heal that only through a human centric lens. We're just going to spend insane amounts of money and time seeing trauma therapists and not
Mm.
get very far
Mm.
if we don't learn how to make ourselves available to our connection with the other than human and the more than human. And I see it in my work with mentees, and when I'm guiding programs, it's like there's this kind of frame of how we need to learn to self-parent and take care of the inner young parts of ourselves,
Mm.
which is
Self-regulate. Mm.
exactly, absolutely true. And there's only so far we can get as
Yeah.
wounded humans living in modernity without getting stuck, and stuck in our own wounding. And it's like, and we need to be able to lean into wild reciprocity with the other than humans and the more than humans, and the shifts that brings across so many levels when we do that is phenomenal. It's really it this kind of expansion into a consciousness that includes our inherent entanglement with the other than human and more than human. It's phenomenal. And we're at a stage now where there's a lot of talking about the need for this. There's a lot of talking about becoming earth-centric, or whatever it is. But actually, the spaces that are really deeply supporting the work that needs to happen within ourselves and in our relationships is rare. It's either happening on a personal well-being level
Mm.
or a kind of conflict and group dynamics level. But rarely is there this work that's really kind of recognizing that there's this very deep composting journey that needs to happen for us to be
Mm.
able to drop into that more than human and other than human kind of community and
Mm.
consciousness. Yeah.
Thank you for speaking to that, and also for bringing this whole topic of privilege and how it relates to this. We're slowly ending our time.
Mm.
Um, but I, at this moment, also with my mothering journey, I would not be able to attend an intensive program like the one that you're
Mm.
hosting. But if I want to do this composting work in my life, is there
Mm.
a place where you would suggest for me to start?
Mhm. It's interesting. We had a number of people, parents, come towards us saying, "Oh my goodness, I so want to participate," but as a parent, and we were well aware of that when we put it out there, that it definitely was a limited audience, people that it would reach. And going forward, I'm really interested to kind of see what it would look like to design something that has that longevity, but that would be uh, would work for parents and others. But in the meantime, before that happens, we offer online kind of drop in kind of opportunities. So, for example, Sarah, who I work with, who's my main collaborator within Starter Culture, offers at each of the kind of solstices and equinoxes and the cross quarter celebrations, they offer an Earth-centric consciousness practice group where this is where you can really drop into practices so that there's a gathering of humans on the screen, and then
Mhm.
there's the invitations to go out onto the land and be with the other than humans and the more than human, and they support those practices. So that would be a really good place for someone like you, a pet, or any other parents or anyone else that's not in Devon. Yeah, to dip in is the online offerings that we are sharing. Yeah,
Thank you so
yeah.
much. Is there
Mm.
any other invitation you would like to speak? Where can people find your program?
Mm. Well, if you're interested and want to find out more about what I've just been speaking about, then there's lots and lots about this terrain on our website, which is starterculture.net. Um,
We can put it
and
in the notes as well.
Yeah, great. And we can put a link to the 18-month program as well. I mean, it's full. We had so many applications. It was so beautiful. And so we are already full, but our hope is that it will be something that we keep continuing to run. And we've had a lot of interest in the other countries I've been in recently, all of them saying, "Oh my goodness, could you bring it here?" So,
Mhm.
in obviously in collaboration with those, that are based and rooting from those cultures, we may well um, take the starter culture elsewhere. That's always been the vision. Yeah. Mm.
This might be one tiny step of spreading it
Yeah.
a tiny bit wider. Thank you
Yeah.
so much for
Yeah.
your
Thank
time,
you.
and thank you really for the work that you're doing and everything that you're bringing. I really appreciate you coming here and sharing, and yeah, bringing also I feel there's something that goes a little bit beyond the words and the knowledge to this space that I feel people might sense a little bit through this
Mm.
conversation. Thank you.
Mm. Yeah. Well, thank you. And thank you for your great questions. And yeah, for bringing in this really important thread around mothering and parenthood, because it's such a creative tension, in terms of how to weave in um, all of what we've been speaking about when being a parent is such a huge, huge aspect of life and so important, and can seem incompatible, kind of with being on this inner journey. And it's touching to see how you're kind of weaving that in, and it's palpable in the way that you show up. So yeah, thank you.
Thank you
Mm.
too.
Mm. Mhm.
So I will just stop the recording.
Yeah.